Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling a really foundational concept for the Christian church, but one that's, well, kind of misunderstood. Apostolic succession.
Yeah, it definitely can be.
Our mission here is to cut through some of that confusion, maybe give you some surprising insights, and basically offer a shortcut to understanding how ministry and authority have been seen to pass down through church history.
That's right. And for this deep dive, we're leaning on some key sources. We've got excerpts from 1 Timothy, specifically chapters 1 through 6 from the ESV Bible, which gives Paul's direct instructions on church order.
Okay.
And we're also bringing in analysis from scholar Perry Robinson, drawing from a couple of his detailed YouTube discussions, focusing specifically on apostolic succession.
Great. So let's just jump right in then. People hear this term apostolic succession and maybe have a vague idea. But what exactly is it? Maybe first, what are the common mistakes people make about it?
Yeah, starting with what it isn't is probably the best way, because there's a lot packed into that term that people often get wrong. So first off, Perry Robinson makes this clear. It is not mere tactual succession.
Actual, like just touching someone.
Exactly. It's not just a spiritual game of tag, where authority is passed just by one person physically laying hands on the next, or just having a long historical list of names.
Okay, so it's deeper than just a physical lineage or a fancy list.
Right. While the laying on of hands and historical lists are involved, they don't define the whole doctrine on their own.
Gotcha. What else?
Well, it's also important to distinguish it from the specific patron succession idea, the one strongly associated with Roman Catholicism.
Relating to the Pope specifically.
Right. It's not the claim that popes are the unique successors of Peter, or that all bishops have to be in communion with the Pope because of special papal powers. I mean, popes are actually elected. They aren't ordained as Pope. So those papal claims are distinct from the general idea of apostolic succession we're looking at.
That's a really key distinction. So it's not an exclusively Catholic idea, and it's not just about papal authority.
Correct. Then there's the misconception that it's just an appeal to antiquity.
Meaning it's old, therefore it's right.
Kind of, yeah.
Yeah.
This is just how it's always been done. While it is ancient, Robinson emphasizes its importance isn't just its age. He says even if the church started last week, ministers would still need that divine commissioning.
Okay, so its validity isn't just based on tradition alone.
Precisely. And it's also not the monarchical episcopate in the sense some people think like only one bishop allowed per city or region.
Oh.
Yeah, you can have coadjutor bishops, assisting bishops, things like that. In this context, monarchical really refers to a single source of the authority to ordain among the ministers.
Okay. The monarchy is about the source of ordination power, not necessarily like one bishop ruling a whole town exclusively. That clears things up.
Exactly. And one last thing, it's not about present-day apostles.
Right. You hear that sometimes, people claiming apostolic authority today.
Yeah, the doctrine of apostolic succession doesn't claim there are modern apostles receiving new revelations or holding that same kind of first-order authority as the original 12. That's a whole different theological discussion.
Okay, so we've cleared away a lot of the common misunderstandings. If it's not those things, what is it? Let's unpack the positive definition.
Right. So Perry Robinson, drawing on the work of Felix Sirot, lays out 4 core principles. First, the theocratic principle.
Theocratic.
Meaning the ultimate source of this divine power and authority is God alone. It doesn't start with humans.
Okay, comes from God. Makes sense.
Second, the hierarchical principle. This means that the divine power and authority can be passed on in greater or lesser degrees.
Like different levels.
Exactly. Think about deacons ordained by apostles. They received a certain authority, but less than the apostles themselves. And crucially, the power to ordain others, to pass on ministry itself, that was specifically kept for the highest order.
Got it. Different levels, and the power to create new ministers is reserved. What's next?
Third, the appointment principle. Appointment to church office is ordinarily done through ordination, specifically by the laying on of hands.
Okay, the laying on of hands we mentioned earlier.
Yes, but here's the key part. This ordination isn't just symbolic. It's understood to convey real spiritual power and authority. Something actual, something spiritual is transmitted in that act.
Wow, okay. Not just a ceremony, but a real transfer.
That's the understanding. And finally, the monarchical principle, but understood as the source. In its developed form, this means only one specific kind of minister. The bishop had the authority, the power, to ordain other ministers, like presbyters and deacons.
Right, connecting back to what you said earlier about the source. So
Exactly.
let's try to sum this up. Apostolic succession is basically the continuation of the ministry started by Christ and the apostles, passed down through distinct ranks or orders, where ordination literally gives spiritual power, and that special power to ordain others is limited to the top rank, the bishops. That feels like a pretty clear framework.
That's a good summary of the core idea, yeah.
And you mentioned earlier that to really get this, we should look back even further to the Old Testament, see the patterns.
Precisely. You really see the seeds of this in the Old Testament structures for divine commissioning and hierarchy. There are sort of two main ways God commissioned people back then.
Okay.
First, what you might call extraordinary commissioning. This is God directly stepping in, calling someone, and authenticating their role, often through miracles or prophecy. Think Moses and Aaron.
Right, with the plagues and everything. Hard to argue with that.
Exactly. God's direct action, undeniable signs, verifying their authority, even to Pharaoh.
Okay, so direct divine appointment. What's the other way?
Ordinary commissioning. This is where individuals get commissioned by someone who is already directly commissioned by God.
Like passing the baton.
Sort of. The Levites, for instance, were commissioned through Aaron, who is directly commissioned by God. It establishes that chain of authority.
I see. And the structure itself.
Well, the Old Testament clearly shows a threefold ministerial structure. You had the high priest at the top, then the ministering priests, and then the Levites. Each had distinct roles and levels of access. Remember, Hebrews 9.6 points out only the high priest could go into the Holy of Holies.
So even way back then, distinct levels, specific functions within the priesthood, not just one big group.
Definitely not. And we even see the laying on of hands for appointment. The classic example is Joshua succeeding Moses in Numbers 27. Moses lays his hand on Joshua, investing him with some of your authority. And Deuteronomy later says Joshua was filled with the spirit of wisdom because Moses had laid his hands on him.
That's a really clear parallel, a transfer of authority and spiritual gifting through the laying on of hands.
It is. And the Old Testament also gives a stark warning about respecting this structure.
Oh, yeah. What's that?
The rebellion of Korah in Numbers 16. Korah and his group, they already had a ministry role, a lower one, but they basically demanded equal status with Moses and Aaron. They wanted the higher office.
And how did that go?
Not well. God condemned their presumption. The earth literally swallowed them up. It's a powerful rejection of this idea of an egalitarian ministry, where people just decide to take offices that weren't given to them.
Wow, that's dramatic.
It is, and it connects directly to Hebrews 5, which says, "No one takes the honor to himself, but receives it when he's called by God, even as Aaron was." You need that legitimate calling and commissioning.
Okay, a really strong foundation in the Old Testament for hierarchy, commissioning, and the dangers of taking authority yourself. So connecting this forward, how do these patterns play out and maybe deepen in the New Testament with Jesus and the apostles?
Well, in the New Testament, it starts right with Christ's direct commissioning of his apostles. It's explicit. Jesus says, "As the Father sent me, so I send you." That's John 17.18.
Okay, a direct parallel. He's sending them with the same authority he received.
Exactly. And in John 15.16, "You did not choose me, but I chose you and appointed you that you would go and bear fruit." It's a deliberate act of divine sending of authorization.
So being sent was crucial.
Absolutely crucial. In the early church, when someone showed up claiming to be a Christian teacher, a fundamental question was often, who sent you? Sometimes even before, what do you teach? Especially with, persecution and Gnostic groups popping up. Romans 10.5 puts it bluntly, how shall they preach unless they are sent? You need that authorization.
So sent meant having that legitimate, traceable authority back to Christ.
That was the idea. And Ephesians 2.20 reinforces this, calling the church built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets with Christ as the cornerstone. They are foundational.
Okay, and what about that laying on of hands? Does that continue clearly?
Oh, very clearly. We see the transfer of authority through laying on of hands multiple times. Take Acts 6, the choosing of the deacons.
Right.
The community, the congregation selects the 7 men, but who actually ordains them? It says the apostles prayed and laid their hands on them.
So the people select, but the apostles confer the actual office and authority. That's a key distinction.
It is, and Paul highlights this repeatedly to Timothy. In 1 Timothy 4.12, he mentions the spiritual gift within you, which was bestowed on you through prophetic utterance with the laying on of hands by the presbytery.
Okay, the presbytery laid hands on them.
Yes, but then look at 2 Timothy 1.6. Paul clarifies, For this reason, I remind you to kindle afresh the gift of God which is in you through the laying on of my hands.
Hmm. So Paul emphasizes his role there. What's the significance of that difference?
Well, the Greek phrasing, according to Robinson and others, suggests Paul's laying on of hands was the instrumental act conveying the gift, the authority. The presbytery's involvement was more like confirming, witnessing, acting conjointly, but Paul was the primary agent.
I see. So Paul's apostolic authority was key in the actual transfer.
That's the argument. It explains why Paul warns Timothy later in 1 Timothy 5.22, do not be hasty in the laying on of hands. It's a serious act, conferring real spiritual responsibility.
Okay. And does this power to ordain get passed on beyond the original 12?
Yes. We see this with figures sometimes called second-order apostles. Look at Titus 1.5. Paul tells Titus, I left you in Crete that you would appoint elders in every city as I directed you.
So Titus, who wasn't one of the 12, is appointing elders, ordaining them.
Exactly. He's exercising a power that wasn't held by just any elder or presbyter. We also see Paul and Barnabas doing this in Acts 14.23. They appointed elders for them in each church.
So the New Testament seems to clearly show different levels, different powers, not just different job titles. What about those titles themselves? Bishop, presbyter, deacon, how did they settle?
That's a good question because the terminology evolves a bit. In the New Testament, especially in 1 Timothy 3, Paul lists qualifications for overseers. The Greek is episkopos, which becomes bishop, and for deacons. These are clearly distinct ordained offices.
Okay, bishop and deacon. What about presbyter or elder?
Presbyter or elder, presbyteros, seems initially to be a more generic term for a minister or leader. Even the Apostle Peter calls himself a fellow presbyter. But as the original 12 apostles began to pass away, the burden of overall leadership and, crucially, ordination fell to those second-order apostles we mentioned, people like James, who led the Jerusalem church but wasn't one of the 12, or Barnabas, Timothy, Titus, Silvanus.
Okay, so this next generation of leaders takes over.
Right. And the title bishop, episkopos, started to become more specifically associated with these figures who had oversight over multiple congregations and the unique power to ordain.
And presbyter.
The term presbyter then solidified into the distinct office below the bishop, often having local oversight of a single congregation, but without the power to ordain others. So you end up with that threefold structure: bishop, presbyter, deacon.
So it mirrors that Old Testament structure we talked about. High priest, Levite becomes bishop, presbyter, deacon.
Exactly. It's a development in terminology and application, but maintaining that core hierarchical principle ordained from the beginning.
That makes a lot of sense, seeing that transition. Now, speaking of 1 Timothy, you mentioned it gives Paul's direct guidance. What are some of the key takeaways from those chapters, especially regarding this ordered ministry and guarding the faith?
Oh, 1 Timothy is absolutely crucial here. Right from chapter 1, Paul, identifying himself as an apostle, charges Timothy, his delegate, essentially to confront false teachers, people pushing different doctrine, myths, and endless genealogies.
So job number 1 is defending sound doctrine.
Yes. Paul says the goal is love from a pure heart, but that requires dealing with teachings that lead to speculations rather than God's work. He emphasizes Timothy has been entrusted with this charge to wage the good warfare, holding on to faith and a good conscience. It sets the tone for responsible leadership.
Leadership isn't passive. It involves actively guarding the truth.
Definitely. Then chapter 3 gets very specific. It lays out detailed qualifications for overseers, bishops, and qualifications for deacons.
Right, we mentioned those titles.
And the qualifications are demanding. Above reproach, husband of one wife, sober-minded, able to teach, managing his own household well, not a recent convert, respected by outsiders. Same for deacons, dignified, tested, holding the faith clearly.
These aren't just suggestions. They're prerequisites for holding these distinct offices. It shows how serious these roles were.
Absolutely. These are high standards for ordained leadership. Then in chapter 4, Paul warns about future departures from the faith, people following deceitful spirits. He tells Timothy to be a good servant by training in godliness and being an example. And crucially, he reminds Timothy again, do not neglect the gift you have, which was given you by prophecy when the council of elders laid their hands on you.
Reinforcing that ordained gift.
Yes. And chapter 5 gives practical instructions for church life, including how Timothy should handle elders. Elders who rule well deserve double honor, especially teachers. But it also addresses discipline.
What does it say about that?
Charges against an elder need 2 or 3 witnesses. If an elder persists in sin, Timothy is to rebuke them in the presence of all, so others will fear. And then that warning again, Do not be hasty in the laying on of hands.
Wow. Public accountability, careful ordination.
Mhm.
It really emphasizes the weight of the office.
It does. And finally, chapter 6 circles back to guarding the faith. Paul warns against false teachers motivated by conceit or greed, contrasting it with godliness, with contentment. He tells Timothy, as a man of God, to flee these things and pursue righteousness. And the final charge, "O Timothy, guard the deposit entrusted to you. Avoid the irreverent babble."
Guard the deposit. That sounds like protecting that core apostolic teaching.
That's exactly how it's understood. Timothy's role, empowered by his ordination, is to steward and protect the faith passed down from Paul.
Okay, 1 Timothy paints a really clear picture of structured, authorized, and accountable ministry. Now, this is where it gets really fascinating for me. How did the people right after the apostles, the very next generations, understand and practice this? What does the early church actually tell us?
The testimony from the early church fathers is, well, remarkably consistent on this. It's quite powerful when you look at it.
Like who? What did they say?
Okay, take the first epistle of Clement. It's usually dated around 80 AD. That's incredibly early, possibly while the Apostle John was still alive.
Wow, okay. What does Clement say?
Clement writes that the apostles, knowing there would be future conflict over the office of bishop, appointed those who have already been mentioned, and afterwards added the further provision that, if they should die, other approved men should succeed to their ministry.
So they planned for succession, explicitly.
That's what Clement records, a deliberate plan for continuation. Then you have Ignatius of Antioch.
He was a disciple of Peter and Paul, right?
Tradition says so, yes. He was martyred around 107 AD. On his way to martyrdom, he wrote several letters to churches, and church order is a major theme.
What did he emphasize?
He urged believers to reverence the deacons as an appointment of Jesus Christ, the bishop as Jesus Christ, and the presbyters as the Sanhedrin of God. He makes these incredibly strong statements like, apart from these bishop, presbyters, deacons, there is no church. And famously, don't do anything without the bishop.
Apart from these, there is no church. That's incredibly strong language for that early on. It points to a very defined structure being seen as essential.
It really does. Fast forward a bit to Irenaeus of Lyons, writing around 189 AD. His big work was against heresies, mainly targeting Gnostics.
Who claim secret knowledge, right?
Exactly. And Irenaeus' counter-argument hinges on public, traceable succession. He argued that the identity of the original apostles, the main content of their teaching, and the identity of their successors were all well known. Public knowledge.
Not secret.
Not secret at all. He basically said anyone teaching something different from this known public apostolic teaching isn't a true successor. He even claimed you could figure out true apostolic teaching just by going to the churches the apostles personally founded and seeing what they all agreed on even, he said, if we didn't have the scriptures.
Wow. Even if we didn't have the scriptures, that says a huge amount about how they viewed the authority residing in the church's living tradition and succession alongside the written word.
It shows the church structure itself was seen as the reliable container and transmitter of the faith. Then there's Hippolytus of Rome around 280 AD. In his work called the Apostolic Tradition, he gives details about ordination rites.
And what do they show?
They make it crystal clear that the bishop alone ordains elders, presbyters, and deacons. Other presbyters might lay hands on a new presbyter alongside the bishop, sort of like confirming or sealing. But Hippolytus stresses that they don't themselves confer the order. Only the bishop does.
So again, that specific power to ordain rests solely with the bishop consistently through these early writers.
Exactly. And by the time you get to the famous Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, the church is formally codifying this. Canon 18 explicitly talks about the three orders, bishop, presbyter, deacon, and smells out their hierarchy, noting deacons are ministers of the bishop and inferiors of the presbyters, and shouldn't, for instance, give communion to presbyters or bishops.
So the Universal Church Council formally recognizes this established three-tiered structure. This seems like, well, an overwhelming amount of consistent evidence from the very beginning.
It really is. And remember, the context, Perry Robinson makes this point too. Christianity was illegal and persecuted for much of this time. Communication was difficult, expensive. You wouldn't expect detailed instruction manuals on church government to survive everywhere.
Right, you'd get glimpses and incidental comments.
Exactly. Or explicit defenses when the structure was challenged. But what's perhaps just as telling is the absence of counter-evidence. Robinson stresses there are no examples, zero examples, of ordination being done only by presbyters in the early church before the 4th century. And when a case like that did pop up later, it was roundly condemned. All the surviving evidence points one way, to episcopal ordination.
Okay. Well, given such a strong historical and biblical case as you've laid it out, the listener might be thinking, okay, but what about all the objections I hear today? We should probably tackle those directly.
Absolutely. Let's do
A
it.
really common one, you hear it all the time, is the objection. Bishops are a later invention. The office of bishop just grew out of the presbyters eventually because, look, the New Testament sometimes uses the words bishop, episkopos, and presbyter, presbyteros, interchangeably. What's the response to that?
Yeah, that's a frequent point. The response, drawing from Robinson and others, is that just because terms are sometimes used interchangeably doesn't mean the offices or functions were identical.
Also,
Well, think about it. Apostles are sometimes called presbyters, too. Deacons can sometimes be generally referred to as ministers or elders. But nobody argues that means apostles are the same as regular presbyters or deacons are the same as apostles. The terms had overlapping ranges, but distinct roles and authorities existed.
okay, so overlapping terms don't equal identical jobs.
Right. And the idea that the higher office, the episcopate, grew out of the lower one, the presbyterate, kind of flips the biblical principle on its head. Hebrews 7:7 says, the lesser is blessed by the greater. Authority flows down, not up. Plus, as we just discussed, there's simply no clear cases. None of presbyters alone ordaining anyone in the early centuries, or deacons ordaining, or lay people ordaining. When 2 presbyters apparently tried it in the 5th century, it was swiftly condemned.
So the historical practice doesn't support that bottom-up growth idea.
Not according to the evidence we have. By the time of Clement, around 95 AD, and Ignatius, 107 AD, you already see that clear episcopal structure. And remember, the apostles themselves, then the second order apostles like Timothy and Titus, were the ones doing the appointing and ordaining. The distinct office of presbyter solidified under the bishop's oversight as the church grew and the first apostles passed on. It fits that Old Testament pattern becoming the New Testament reality. Bishop, presbyter, deacon.
Okay, that makes sense. It addresses the terminology issue and the historical development. What's another big objection?
The objection based on the priesthood of all believers. People say, if we're all priests, why do we need a separate, distinct ministerial priesthood?
Right, I hear that constantly. We're all ministers, so why this special ordained class?
Well, the response acknowledges, yes, absolutely, there is a universal priesthood of all baptized believers, but that doesn't negate a distinct ministerial priesthood. Look again at the Old Testament. Israel as a whole was called a kingdom of priests, a holy nation. But did that mean there was no specific Levitical priesthood? No sons of Aaron set apart for specific priestly duties? Of course not. Both existed simultaneously.
Okay. So it's not an either.
Exactly. All baptized Christians share in Christ's priesthood in a general way. Some traditions mark this with confirmation or chrismation, but there's also a specific ordained ministerial priesthood set apart for particular functions, like presiding at the Eucharist, forgiving sins, and, crucially, ordaining others. Remember Acts 6.
The deacons again.
Right. The whole community selected the men, but the apostles laid hands on them to ordain. It wasn't just a popular vote, it was a conferral of office and grace by those already holding authority. Ordination conveys a real gift, real authority. It's not just symbolic recognition. From this perspective, it's noteworthy that many Protestant confessions frankly say their ordinations don't convey a specific spiritual gift, suggesting they operate on a different understanding.
So the general priesthood and the specific ministerial priesthood can, and historically did, coexist. Okay.
Yeah.
What about the argument that, well, apostolic succession isn't laid out like a neat doctrine in the New Testament?
That's the objection. It isn't clearly spelled out as a formal doctrine in the New Testament, maybe like the Trinity is, so maybe it wasn't a primary concern.
Yeah, you don't find a chapter titled Apostolic Succession. So what's the response?
The response is that many core Christian doctrines aren't laid out with formal technical definitions in the New Testament. Think about the Trinity itself, or the hypostatic union, or even the exact mechanics of justification.
True. Those were developed and defined more fully over time based on Scripture.
Exactly. They're inferred and synthesized from many scriptural passages, explicit statements, and incidental details. Apostolic succession is similar. The importance is seen in the actions and assumptions within the New Testament and the early church. Remember that question, who sent you? That was paramount. For them, having authorized ministers wasn't secondary, it was fundamental to the church's existence and the reliability of its message. The idea some have today that just the Bible and God's Spirit is sufficient without properly sent ministers is seen as problematic from this historical view. Robinson mentions examples like the Taiping Rebellion in China, a tragic case where someone heard the gospel from a missionary but then claimed divine authority himself, leading to catastrophe. Order and authorization matter.
That's a sobering example. It highlights the potential dangers of unauthorized ministry. Okay, but what about this objection? Look around today. Many Christian groups without strict apostolic succession seem to be doing good work, like missionaries planting churches. Doesn't that suggest formal succession isn't really necessary?
That's a practical and common question. The response usually starts by clarifying that the doctrine doesn't mean lay Christians can't preach, teach, or share the gospel. Of course they can and should.
Okay.
But it's about the ordained ministry and the sacraments and the formal structure of the church. From the perspective of traditions holding to apostolic succession, like Orthodoxy or Catholicism, other groups that take the office to themselves, while perhaps containing sincere Christians doing good things, are seen as operating outside the divinely established framework for ordained ministry. They might be respected as professing Christians, but their communities are often viewed technically as being in schism, or not churches in the proper sense, lacking that validly transmitted ministerial authority.
So a distinction between individual faith, or good works, and the formal authoritative structure of the church.
Yes. The church, in this view, is a visible, structured society with publicly authorized ministers, not just an invisible collection of believers. While God's grace can certainly work outside these structures, the structures themselves are seen as the normative means God established. Ideally, ministries begun outside this structure would eventually seek to be ratified or regularized by bishops within the succession. It's a different understanding of church authority compared to, say, many independent evangelical efforts.
Understood. Now, what about the human element? Bishops aren't perfect. The objection comes up. Bishops aren't infallible. They can fall into heresy like Arius or serious moral failure like, say, the controversies around Bishop Pike. Doesn't that break the chain or invalidate the system?
That's a very fair and important question. The response is emphatic. The doctrine absolutely does not claim bishops are infallible or sinless.
Okay, good to clarify.
St. John Chrysostom, a famous bishop himself, is quoted as saying something like, "The pavement of hell is lined with the skulls of bishops." They knew the risks and realities. Even Judas was one of the original 12 apostles chosen by Christ.
Right.
So the failure of an individual doesn't negate the office or the principle. As the saying goes, the abuse of a principle does not negate its proper use. The system of apostolic succession is actually seen to work precisely because it has a built-in mechanism, at least in theory, for dealing with such failures.
Which is?
Conciliarity. Brother bishops acting together in council, conciliari, they have the authority to judge, correct, and even depose other bishops for serious heresy or moral failings to maintain the integrity of the faith and the ministry. It requires vigilance and cooperation, but the accountability structure is part of the system.
So the system itself includes the means for self-correction, even if flawed humans don't always apply it perfectly.
That's the idea.
Okay, what about the nature of unity? Objection. Isn't Christian unity fundamentally spiritual and invisible? Why depend on a visible organizational structure, like apostolic succession?
This touches on the very definition of the church. The response is that, yes, unity has a deep spiritual dimension, but in the New Testament and early church, it's also profoundly visible and tangible.
How so?
Think about the Eucharist sharing the same bread and cup at the same table. That's a visible act of unity. Think about Paul's authority to excommunicate someone. "I have handed such and such over to Satan." That implies a real, visible community you can be put out of.
Good point. Being in or out was a real thing.
Exactly. And remember Ignatius saying, "Don't do anything without the bishop." That points directly to visible order being essential for unity. From this perspective, the organization isn't separate from the spiritual. Rather, the organization is the spiritual because the Spirit indwells it, dwells in the body of Christ. It's an incarnational view. Real, physical, historical structures have vested spiritual powers. It's not just an invisible ideal.
The spiritual takes form in the visible structure. Okay, let's get historical again. Objection. Have there been documented deviations? Have whole churches or lines of bishops fallen away from the original faith? If so, doesn't that break the chain and undermine the claim of unbroken succession?
That's a complex historical question. The response is yes, absolutely. Particular bishops and even entire patriarchates or groups of churches have, from the perspective of others, fallen into doctrinal error at various times. Think of the early controversies like Arianism
Right.
and the ongoing disputes between, say, the Eastern Orthodox, Roman Catholic, and Oriental Orthodox churches are precisely arguments about who stayed faithful to the original deposit and who went into schism. They each claim to hold the fullness of the unbroken succession.
So they all claim it, but disagree on who holds it correctly.
Essentially, yes. For example, the Catholic Church generally recognizes Orthodox orders as valid. Their priests don't need reordination if they become Catholic, but the Orthodox generally don't fully reciprocate, viewing Catholic sacraments as lacking fullness outside Orthodoxy.
What about Anglicans? Their succession is often discussed.
Anglican succession is seen as particularly problematic from both Catholic and Orthodox viewpoints. Historically, due to political compromises during the English Reformation leading to ambiguous ordination rites and theology, Rome officially declared Anglican orders null and void back in the 19th century, citing issues like a perceived defect in intention and form, sometimes linked to stories like the Nag's Head fable alleging irregular consecrations.
Right, historical debates there.
And more recently, the ordination of women to the priesthood and episcopate in many Anglican provinces is seen by Orthodox and Catholics as a definitive break, something that fundamentally pollutes the episcopacy, as Robinson puts it, and invalidates the ministry from their perspective. Many Anglican bodies today are viewed by them as having drifted very far from historic Christian profession.
So deviations and breaks are acknowledged, but the argument is about who maintained the authentic line.
Correct. And proponents of Orthodox succession, for instance, would point to their church's ability to preserve the ministry under massive persecution for centuries under Islam, under communism with countless martyrs, as strong evidence of divine preservation and faithfulness to that apostolic continuity.
That historical endurance through suffering is definitely a powerful argument for them. Okay, last objection, and it's a big one. Objection. Is apostolic succession actually necessary for salvation? Does someone have to be part of a church with this specific structure to be saved?
This is probably the most sensitive question. The response historically leans on the ancient affirmation, extra ecclesiam nulla salus, outside the church, there is no salvation.
That sounds quite definitive.
It does. Now, how that's understood needs care. If apostolic succession is considered essential to the church being the church in its fullness, then yes, belonging to that church ordinarily is seen as necessary for salvation.
Ordinarily. That sounds like an important qualifier.
Very important. God is not bound by the means he establishes. He can save anyone, anywhere, anyhow he chooses. Think of the Holy Spirit falling on the Gentiles in Acts before Peter even finished preaching or laid hands on them. God can work extraordinarily.
Okay.
But the church, with its sacraments and its validly ordained ministry through apostolic succession, is seen as the ordinary, the secure, the fixed, the identifiable means God has established for bringing people into his family and conveying his grace. The very message of salvation comes through the church and its authorized ministers.
So it's the normal, God-given pathway, even if God can take detours.
That's a good way to put it. Rejecting the church or its necessary means, like baptism when you know better, is seen as damning rather than simply lacking access through no fault of your own. Robinson also points out that the issue today is defining the boundaries of the church and having the courage to exercise church discipline, especially on moral issues. Without clear boundaries and authority, things dissolve. The faith isn't just a private opinion, it's a received communal reality, something bigger than me.
So individuals outside the visible boundaries might receive grace, but the relationship is seen as incomplete.
Yes, from this viewpoint, while individuals outside the visible structures might be recipients of grace and have a genuine, if partial, relationship with God, that relationship is considered incomplete and deformed, compared to full incorporation into the visible body of Christ through its sacraments and ministry. It's not formally recognized as full membership.
That's a lot to process.
Yeah.
It really challenges some common modern assumptions about church and salvation. Okay, so bringing this all together, what does this deep dive mean for you, the listener? Why should you care about these, seemingly ancient debates about church structure?
Well, I think understanding apostolic succession, whether you ultimately agree with it or not, helps clarify what's even meant by the church. Is it just an invisible idea, or is it, as historic Christianity has largely maintained, a visible, identifiable society of people? This framework gives you a lens to understand that.
Right. It forces you to think about what the church is
Exactly. It also provides that historical and theological context for how Christian authority, ministry, and the passing down of doctrine have been understood for, well, 2,000 years. It helps make sense of why certain traditions operate the way they do.
And it highlights the importance placed on properly commissioned ministry for things like church order, administering sacraments, and guarding against false teaching.
Precisely. It's about the integrity and continuity of the body of Christ. Thinking through these issues helps you evaluate how different Christian groups understand their own roots and authority. Hopefully, this deep dive gives you that shortcut to being well informed, cutting through some noise, and maybe sparking some aha moments in your own thinking.
Absolutely. And as you think about all this, maybe mull this over. If we take seriously that historical understanding of the church as a visible society and Christ's promise that the gates of hell will not prevail against it, how might these insights about apostolic succession, about a tangible historical continuity of authority, shape your view of Christian unity, the nature of real spiritual authority, and the church's role and identity in the world today?
Yeah, that's definitely something worth chewing on. How does visible continuity relate to Christ's promise? It's a deep question.